I'm Melanie Sayward, and you are tuning in to The Pink Elephant. Hey, Pink Elephant listeners. Hope you're all doing well out there and surviving with the speed at which this year is going. How are we almost at the end of April? It's just not right. Well, this month we finished a 3-part series about worship with another interview. And for this episode, I have the Reverend Dr Melinda Cousins to share about the Psalms. I heard Melinda speak a fair few years ago, and she had such an interesting contribution to the discussion of the Psalms. And being a book of the Bible often synonymous with worship, I thought she might be the right person to finish off this series. So a little bit about Melinda. Melinda is the Director of Ministries for the Baptist Churches of South Australia and Northern Territory. So yeah, she keeps quite busy. She's been an ordained pastor for about 23 years. She's worked in pastoral leadership as well as a lecturer in biblical studies, both Old and New Testaments. And she did her PhD back in 2016. I think it's safe to say that she is really passionate about the Word of God, and you will hear that coming through when you listen to the episode. Other than that, I hope you get stacks out of this episode because honestly, I really did. And with all that being said, enjoy this month's episode. Hey, Melinda, it is so good to have you on the podcast today and to be talking to you about all about the Psalms. Yeah, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Awesome. The crazy thing is you are the second Melinda that we've had on the podcast this season. So wow. there's only one. I had to make sure there was an episode between you both because just in case people got you confused. Yeah. I know. You might be the second Melinda I know. So it's very interesting. And I'm a Mel, so let's hope nobody gets confused. So, but look, I realise that the listeners who, check in regularly with this podcast may not know who you are. They may, but they may not. And we would love if you
could not.
If you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Yep. So I live in Adelaide, South Australia, in the city, in the CBD, and I'm a pastor by training. Worked in local churches and worked in mission organisations, but I currently serve the movement of Baptist Churches of South Australia and the Northern Territory as Director of Ministries. So lead a team there, which is a lot of fun, and lots of opportunities to connect with people across the state, mostly in the territory where I work, but also nationally as well.
It's actually quite a broad region that you cover then.
It is a big area geographically, yes.
Yes.
Smaller population than most areas that are that big. But we actually merged just over a year ago, SANT together.
Right. And I mean, most people know, isn't Adelaide called the City of Churches, or that's kind of what it's referred to?
That is, yes, it is a bit of a moniker. It has City of Churches. I sometimes joke that it's the city of church buildings that used to be churches and are now and other things. The architecture, but there's a lot of amazing churches, communities of people, communities of faith right across Adelaide. But I think the name comes from the city having particular buildings in it.
Right. I have visited a few of those churches in that city too, which the first time I went to Adelaide, it was beautiful. Yes, really lovely. So what about you? So you're obviously a Christian, that's, how did that come to be?
Yeah, so look, I have a bit of a background. My parents grew up in the church and my grandparents prayed for me, and I had some connection with the church as a child, but I would say I met Jesus when I was about 15. I had a good friend at high school who invited me to a youth group. And I met some amazing people there and, who were on fire for Jesus, and started learning and listening and reading the Bible, and had an experience that changed my life.
Oh, wow. Isn't it awesome? The number of stories I hear where it was a youth group person that invited you to youth, and then, it's awesome. So cool. Yeah. And you've obviously done a PhD as well, which is actually how I came across you through the Arrow program.
Yeah.
So how did you I presume you were studying theology or something before that. How did that even end up happening?
Yeah. I mean, I am a perpetual student. I love to study, although it's been interesting. The journey of my PhD was kind of tried to get me out of my head a bit. So I studied theology degree after and during university, and then did a bit of further study in depth, did my master's, and then I was doing some teaching and was encouraged to consider a PhD and how that might fit into it. I haven't ended up going on with the teaching, but the PhD and the study I did has certainly shaped the way I do ministry and life in all kinds of other ways.
That's awesome. Well, look, obviously, I'll let you talk a little bit more about your like PhD and what you specifically focused in on. But one of the big reasons I wanted to invite you on is because we've been looking at worship for these first three sessions of this season, and obviously the Psalms is a common, very common discussion point when it comes to worship because of David and the incredible things that he's written. And I think when I heard you speak at the Arrow program, I think that might have been one of the first times that I even came to realize that there were more layers to the Psalms
Okay.
in terms of the corporate aspect of the
Right.
Psalms as well, which I was blown away by. And interestingly, I've been so involved in worship all my Christian life, but
Yeah.
for some reason, I don't necessarily gravitate to the Psalms so much myself. So that, yeah, that was one of the reasons why I was like, oh, wow, there's more to the Psalms than I thought. So I assume there will be many in the same boat as I was several years ago. Tell us, what attracted you to the Psalms?
Yeah, why the Psalms? Oh, look, I mean, I obviously come to the end point now and just think, why wouldn't anybody be attracted to the Psalms? But I also think the more you study something, the more you fall in love with it. And the more, particularly when it's something of God's word. So I talk about the Psalms as like the prayers and the poems and the songs of the people of God, and this incredible richness of expression that is gifted to us and this invitation to participate in them. But I experienced that before I understood that for sure. So when I was a child, so one of my first memories is being 6 years old, going to a Sunday school and being taught to memorize Psalm 139 in the Children's Living Bible version, which to this day is the only version in which I can say that psalm because it is so deeply embedded in my memory. Anything else sounds wrong. So there was a sense of, that early connection with the Psalms. But then as I became a Christian later in life, there were times in my life, particularly when I went through some difficult experiences, where God led me to the Psalms and really spoke to me through the Psalms about some grief, about some decision making and discernment. So it was just interesting a number of times throughout my life, the Psalms had popped up as a way that God had really spoken deeply into my life.
Mm.
But then when I studied my Bachelor of Theology, we did not look at the Psalms at all.
Oh, how interesting.
I know there was no Psalms content. We did the whole Old Testament as a sort of historical framework of the story of the people of God, but we didn't look at the songs of the people of God. And so it wasn't actually till I was doing my master's, had the chance to do an intensive on the Psalms. And I think like a lot of people with a lot of subjects, I had an amazing teacher who again just brought out that love for the Psalms. So a teacher by the name of Tremper Longman IV, who is an American scholar, came to Australia to do a couple of weeks and just blew me away with his love for and passion for the Psalms. I really got into them then. And then I had the opportunity to do a little bit of study in Israel as part of my master's.
Yeah.
And these incredible memories. I remember the first time I was in Jerusalem and we walked out of the place we were staying and we walked through the gates of the old city of Jerusalem and we stopped at the gate and the lecturer read Psalm 122, which says, "Our feet are standing in your gates, O Jerusalem."
Wow.
And just that moment of, the scriptures came alive. Like this was written by someone who was right here, who was trying to express their experience. So those kind of things, came together. That when I was looking to do my PhD, I'd already had this love for the Psalms. I thought it would be something that I would enjoy studying as well as useful for what I was seeking to do.
Yeah, how interesting. So, I mean, can you maybe give us a picture of what you were trying to understand in your like thesis, like with your PhD?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. We say what you're trying to understand. It's like what I set out to understand and what I actually did understand, which are often quite different when you do study over that intense period of time. So as I said, I'm a bit of a lifelong student, and so I can get in my head and, focused on sort of analysing the Psalms. And what I realised by studying the Psalms is you can't analyse them. They're not meant to be in your head. They're actually meant to be voiced and embodied and enacted is the word that I ended up using. And so it was a real journey for me of actually God inviting me to get a little bit out of my head, even though I was doing this really academic study, and to engage with my body and my imagination and my emotions, because that's the invitation of the Psalms. So that's kind of the big picture. I was looking at a particular group of Psalms, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute, but those are kind of the big. And so I used a methodology, or one of the methodologies I used was actually what's called performance criticism, which sounds a little bit more than it is. It's not about putting on a performance, but this idea of embodying and enacting texts rather than just reading them, and particularly rather than just reading them silently with our eyes, actually reading them with our voices and our bodies. And that was just, this incredible gift to study them in a different way.
So are you saying that there's particular psalms that were meant to be read like as a congregation together, or like voiced, vocally declared, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah. Yeah. Look, my suggestion would be that the entire book of Psalms, that's what it is. It's a gift to the community of faith, to the people of God. It can be used privately and personally and can be studied and can be analyzed. But its primary purpose was actually to be embodied, enacted, sung, spoken by the community together. And
Mm.
so I think the real power of the Psalms lies when we actually engage with them in that way as well. So you can
Yes.
read the Psalms, as a historical record of people's faith back then, and you can certainly read them as this kind of really deep spirituality and engage with people's personal spirituality in that. But I think their primary purpose is actually that invitation to embodiment as a community.
It's so interesting that you say that, and I realize I'm veering off a little bit from our questions that we've got.
Right.
But I can't really call it a deep dive because I don't always have time to do a full-on deep dive for the sake of the podcast. I do the best that I can.
Sure.
I try and pick some really good text and read what I can. But I did do an episode last month, which I know we're kind of doing this one like after that one. But it was all about worship. And one of the things that I actually, for the first time, was not being conclusive in what I was trying to say. I was actually going, I'm wondering about the significance of worship from a congregational perspective. So there's things like in even the New Testament that seems to be encouraging that worship is not necessarily always about, it's not always about us being individually engaged with God. It's actually supposed to be an encouragement to each other. And so like it's that, that whole thing of, continuing to encourage each other with hymns and spiritual songs. And so I find that so interesting that this is coming up again, this kind of collective, we worship God together. Whereas, obviously these days we probably are quite individualized in how we worship. Like we might be together in a church when we worship, but often the actual songs are quite like, I'm not
very eye focused. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also, I'm not even paying attention to what everybody else is doing. I'm certainly not singing it for their encouragement, unless I'm singing on stage, right? Because you're leading them. But yeah, I just find that very interesting that this like sort of corporate aspect to worship, but also in this case, you're talking about just corporate, like the people of God declaring these things that seem like are both personal, but represent that group of people also. So yes, that's just a note. Very interesting. So, I mean, you've sort of alluded to it a little bit, but what were your findings? Like, what was the things that kind of were like, whoa, like, especially for you, like what was the big ticket things?
Yeah. Yeah. So the big ticket things were these three ideas of emotion, imagination, and embodiment. And so I did some research where I learned and spoke out and embodied these Psalms, these 15 Psalms I was looking at. And then I had other people kind of participate in that and then research and ask them questions about it. And those were these three key ideas that I'd already come across, but that came out in almost everybody. That was like the huge finding, was that people said, by listening to them, by hearing them, by seeing them embodied, I engaged my imagination. It engaged my body. I could feel it, and my emotions. What I found really interesting was a lot of people, I had a question about what did you learn? And a lot of people said, but I didn't really learn anything. And I realized that what they were saying was I didn't gain any new information. And that for me was fascinating, that maybe sometimes we come to the scriptures expecting that the goal is to learn new information. But actually it goes back to what you were just saying about worship. I think worship is formative, not just by the transfer of information into our minds, but by how it speaks to our hearts and how it speaks to our imaginations and how it engages with our whole selves and our relationships and that community dynamic. And the formation of the people of God happens in a whole range of ways beyond just that learning information. And as someone who's been a lifelong academic, it's weird for me to be saying that because I love learning information.
Yes, it's all cognitive. It's all like, yes.
Yeah, but there's so much more to it, and there's such a richness and so much, that's profound in being invited into that.
It is interesting, isn't it? Because like we do have that's just profound in itself, the idea that new information immediately transfers to new experience. Whereas when I say experience, I don't mean like, like the kind of ethereal experience. I mean, like we don't necessarily know the love of God until there is an opportunity for us to experience it through his faithfulness in some circumstance. Or so there is like that. We have a tendency to intellectualize, which we want to do if you're studying a PhD like you are, but also like there's this disconnect between, what it means for it to be true in
Absolutely.
us. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's great.
So I feel like you've already alluded to this, but then what do you think then is what the biggest thing or tendency we have in misunderstanding the Psalms?
Yeah, look, there's probably a few, but the one that comes to mind and certainly something that was encouraged of me. So I've had people say to me when I was younger in particular, like, if you go to the Psalms, you'll find there, prayers that will reflect how you're feeling. So John Calvin famously said, every emotion any human being's ever felt is found in the Psalms. I don't know if anyone tested that theory, but it seems to ring true. But I was sort of taught to go to the Psalms as almost a reflection of my emotions. So finding voice for what I was already feeling. And that's an amazing gift. But I think that is a misunderstanding, because I think the invitation of the Psalms is to actually take on their posture towards God, their emotion, their imagination, their relationship with God, even if you like, to step into the shoes and the voice of the people who wrote them, to make that voice our own and to see how we encounter God in doing that. And so that's something I think, if the Psalms are just sort of, often say, just, black words on a white page, they don't do that until we actually step into them in that way.
That is absolutely so interesting. And it makes me think too that like it would be so interesting to see the impact of like what you got those individuals to do over a longer period of time. Because I presume it was like, a one session or maybe a two session that you had.
That's right. Yeah, always. Yeah. I mean, sure. That's the goal of the church, right? Formation, worship is formation. Yeah. How do we see over time how that kind of continued engagement in worship is actually formative and shaping, not just of us as individuals, but of us as a community. Absolutely.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I remember hearing you talk about many years ago now, obviously, but I can vaguely recall you using this word journey in the Psalms. And so I would love if you could tell me a little bit about that focus on journey, because journey is like such an overused term these days, of course. It's a journey, all that kind of stuff. But there's something so rich about that word journey when it's in the biblical text, I feel. And so, yes, please tell us what is this journey focus in the Psalms?
Sure. So probably would use the word pilgrimage if you like from the text itself. And that's the particular group of Psalms I looked at. So Psalms 120 through to 134, these 15 Psalms in a row, all share this same little title. Literally, the Hebrew would translate to the song of the steps, the songs of the goings up. But that word for going up or steps, a sense, is the word that was used for pilgrimage in the Old Testament. So these are the pilgrimage songs.
Right.
And so they're connected to this idea of journey. Originally, like historically, that would have been literal. Like the people of Israel, when they lived, in the land, would actually go up to Jerusalem for pilgrimage, to go to the festivals, to go to the temple.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this connection between these Psalms and that journey of making your way to Jerusalem for the festival, that's kind of this historical context of them. And you can see that in some of them. So the first couple of the Psalms in particular, of that collection, Psalm 121 and 122 are probably the best known. And 121 is really a journey psalm. That's, I lift my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? I'm walking through the mountains and I'm looking around and trusting, and it talks about the Lord guiding your steps and watching over you by day and by night. And you see how that would relate to a journey. And then the very next Psalm is our feet are standing in your gates, O Jerusalem, and celebrating arriving at the destination. So they really capture that. And the last couple of Psalms in the collection also really celebrate arriving and being a part of that worship, that corporate worship that ancient Israel experienced in Jerusalem. The interesting thing is the rest of them, you could say, what's the rest of them doing there? Because they're not explicitly about journey, but they're more about the daily stuff of life. So you've got a psalm in there about building a house, Psalm 127, and you've got a psalm about sitting around the table with your family, Psalm 128. You've got psalms about servants and masters, 123. And it's this very daily life, kind of mundane almost stuff. But that's what I found interesting, because like you said, that idea of it being a journey, that life is a journey, that life is a pilgrimage. So in ancient Israel, they literally went on pilgrimage. What I found fascinating is when that stopped. So when the temple was destroyed, the exile happened, they were no longer living in the land. Throw these psalms away. They didn't say, oh, we only use them when you actually literally go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. They continue to sing these songs, which suggests that pilgrimage becomes maybe more of a metaphor for life, the life of faith, and that idea of faith is a journey, and that we're all doing it day by day.
It's so reflective, isn't it? Like even as you were talking about, I was like, yes, I can see that it's like the daily activities of life, but it's like this idea of engaging God within that, like, and so they're reflecting on the things that are happening, like as and in conjunction with God's presence with them in those more mundane moments, right?
Mundane, for sure. Like, it's one of the things I love about these Psalms. So people are, one of the other practical reasons why I study these Psalms is they're a little bit understudied. Compared to the other Psalms, they haven't had as much work done on them. And I think that's because sometimes people read them and go, oh, they're a bit mundane, they're a bit ordinary. But there's something so rich and beautiful in the ordinariness of the life of faith. And a bit of a tangent for me, but there's this, I've come across recently a couple of books of liturgy called Every Moment Holy by Douglas McKelvey. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, but he writes these amazing prayers and liturgies for the people of God about the most mundane things. Like, he has this book which has, a prayer for the hearing of a siren, or a prayer for the changing of a nappy. And he's got one, a prayer for starting a good book, and then like a lament for the ending of a beloved book. And just really daily stuff. I'm like, that's what these Psalms are about, acknowledging God's presence and worshiping God in the ordinary.
I love that. So then what do you think is the significance of pilgrimage or journey, like, to the people of God, like in the narrative of the Old Testament? I actually just randomly picked up Pilgrim's Progress to read with my daughter, who she's like neurodivergent. So I was like one page in and she wasn't even paying attention, but I was like, oh, I think I need to reread this. And the timing is so interesting because I knew I was going to be talking to you about this as well. But yeah, I mean, it must be quite significant if that's if it's in there in that way.
Yeah, look, I think so. And the thing that I realized is, obviously, whenever you study a particular part, you then see how it connects to the whole. And so once I studied these particular Psalms about pilgrimage, you start to realize how much this idea of journey, and particularly the idea of walking, because that's how they would have made the journey, is everywhere in the scriptures. So, this idea that God calls Abraham in the Old Testament to be a pilgrim, to walk, to go to a place that he doesn't even know where he's going. God takes him on this journey and he walks there. That the people of God are this pilgrim people throughout the scriptures, and that kind of metaphor. And like you said, Pilgrim's Progress, I mean, there's a number of books written throughout church history where this idea kind of captures us, that being the people of God means being on a pilgrimage or being on a journey. And particularly that idea of walking, I think that it's a metaphor. So I think throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, the language of walking is used often for faith. So some English translations seem to smooth that over, and so we make it more abstract. But certainly in the original languages, it's really concrete, this idea that you walk your faith, you walk towards, Jesus, walks with his disciples on the road, and he says, anyone who wants to follow me, walk, like you walk with him. And just seeing that everywhere and realizing how significant that is as a metaphor for faith. But I actually think it's more than a metaphor. It's actually the reality that you have to live out faith by walking it out every day, wherever your feet take you, that's place where you practice the life of faith.
The thing that I like about the imagery of pilgrimage is that I think, like, in our Western mindset, we do tend to be quite destination focused, like, and like we'll be looking at the next promotion or the next thing, or so we don't value always the journey aspect because we are looking to what that journey brings. Yeah, like we in fact, we often think we're just going to get through this, or we're just going to survive. Whereas I feel like it's quite significant to use that kind of term of pilgrimage, maybe more so than journey, because of the overuse of it, we've sort of lost the significance of it too. But that for us, actually, the journey is the formative part. Like it's quite significant that God is actually probably even more invested in what is becoming of us and who we are becoming. Not always necessarily that we're arriving at the specific thing that we're thinking is going to solve all of our problems. So, I mean, yeah.
I've heard people say, life is what happens along the way. We can have this mindset of, if I just, when I finish my studies, when I get my job, when I get married, when I have kids, when I retire, when I do, when I get to the thing. But actually, life is what happens along the way. And that's where God is seeking to work. Yeah, I think that's incredible. And I had a few experiences around the time I was doing my studies, actually literally connected to my feet, that really spoke to me about that. So I realized, like we jump in cars and we jump on planes and we're suddenly on the other side of the world in, it feels like a long time from Australia, but really in 15 hours, we've traveled the whole world, and we haven't had a journey. Like, we've just there. And so there's something in our culture that maybe misses walking. Whereas I moved into the city around the time I was doing my PhD. And so I use my car a lot less and I walk around the city because I live in the CBD. And then I had this, I can't believe I'm sharing this story, but I had this experience where I broke my ankle. So I tripped over, broke my ankle. And while my ankle was in a boot, I tripped over and sprained the other ankle.
Oh, no.
Incredibly clumsy of me. And I'm very thankful that, it wasn't worse. And, I know there are people who live with significant disabilities, but for me to have that experience of not being able to use my feet. So as I started kind of regaining the use of my feet, and I was watching my steps very closely because I was paranoid about doing something again, just really brought home to me how significant walking is and how it grounds you. And then speaking to people from our Indigenous churches and the idea of walking on country.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. And realizing how important that was to the Hebrew people as well. And I thought, man, my culture that I've grown up in, I've lost something of that connection to my feet, to the place where they are, and trying to recapture something of that has been really significant in thinking about, how my faith is grounded and takes place in a daily context.
And even it's incremental, right? Like, it's not the rushed kind of thing that we're often wanting it to be. Yes, yes. So the Psalms are often mentioned when discussing worship. So, which is part of the reason why I invited you on here, right? We're talking about worship.
Yeah.
So do you think there is a relationship then between worship and this journey or pilgrimage idea?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because absolutely, the Psalms are worship in a sense of they are prayer, they are praise. They're also, lament and thanksgiving and Psalms of hope and confidence, and Psalms of, all kinds of different types of worship that are maybe different to what we're used to. So in terms of connecting them to what we might usually term worship in terms of that corporate gathered experience, absolutely connection with the Psalms. But I think for me, the journey metaphor, the journey reality links to the idea that worship is a whole of life response to God.
Yes.
So I would define worship as everything we do in response to God. So when we gather together as the people of God, we respond in a particular way by declaring who He is, by joining our voices together. And that's amazing and so important. But it's also worship when we then take that and live that out in practice. So I think that journey metaphor maybe helps us connect, I guess, for a lot of people, what we do when we gather on a Sunday and praise together, and how that is played out in our lives in the daily. I think that maybe connection between the two is that journey piece.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, talking about this is making me think of all of the different references there is to, like, walking or stepping out, or I just thought of the other one too, but now it's dropped out of my mind. But, like this morning itself, like, I was like trying to get my daughter to do something that she's been a little bit afraid to do. And I literally said to her, you got to step out in faith. And then, so we're talking about walking, and then there's, walking by the Spirit. And then there's, like, so it just like seems like there's so much language actually, how good are the feet of one who brings, good news.
Feet are everywhere in the Bible. Seriously.
Yes. It's so interesting, like the symbolism. And I could be wrong, I don't know, but I presume that some of that also is like linked into the fact that the people of God were somewhat nomadic as well, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So it's just kind of like embeds this, like, that would have been their experience. So this is like really connects with them and helps them engage with like their own faith journey as well, which is just all interesting. But how would you, I suppose, coming to a bit of a close here, how would you encourage Christians to develop depth in their reading of the Psalms? This podcast is all about depth. We're always trying to go deeper in to subjects that, we're often uncomfortable talking about, things like contentment and, fear, but just going that bit deeper into it. And so I would love it if people were able to listen to this episode and go, I want to go deeper in the Psalms. How can I do that? What would you say?
Yeah, okay. I think we often read the Psalms way too quickly. That's possibly true for the whole of Scripture, but the Psalms in particular, I think there's just this invitation, if you're actually going to feel what they feel and imagine what they picture and embody what they enact, you have to slow down and take time to do that. So I think reading them quickly is a trap. And so how do we invite people into depth by time? I've also become a big advocate. I would say read the Psalms aloud always. I think reading with our eyes, like scanning with our eyes, is a fundamentally different experience to voicing and hearing ourselves voicing. So become big advocate for reading them aloud, and also not just for the Psalms, this is for the whole of Scripture, but particularly for the Psalms. I really would encourage people to consider internalizing the Psalms. So what I mean by that is
Yes.
what people think of as memorizing. But the problem with saying memorize is it's all about our heads. Again, it's all cognitive. So people think memorizing means I have to intellectually, in my mind, word perfect, rote learn this psalm. And I don't think that's the intention. I think if the invitation is to embody and enact them, then internalizing the idea that you carry a psalm with you and within you, which is actually, going back to the beginning, what I've done with Psalm 139 since I was 6 years old. Like I carry that psalm inside me. I don't always say it word perfectly, but I carry it with me. That is just a psalm that's, Lord, you have examined my heart. When I sit and you chart the path ahead of me, it lives in me. And that speaks into my life in a different way than something that sits external on a page that I read.
It's very interesting that you say that. I reckon it was about maybe a year or two ago. This is just more getting personal. But I was actually in prayer and I just had this picture come up in my head of an app on my phone, and the app was titled Psalm 100. And I was like, what? That's really weird. And I was like, oh, app, like that's short for application. So I was like, oh, is that maybe the Holy Spirit telling me to apply Psalm 100? Right. So I went and I looked at Psalm 100, and naughty me, I have not memorized Psalm 100, but I was going and reading it like very like in a paced way, so that each time I read a phrase, I was kind of reflecting it back onto me and going to that point where you kind of go, yes, I agree with that. Yep, I comprehend it, not just mentally, but yes, this is true. I take this in, kind of thing. And it's an interesting psalm, actually, because it's not like it's got anything very specific to my circumstance, but it's just like a gratefulness, like kind of praise God kind of psalm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was like, oh, okay. Maybe this was God's way of telling me I need to thank him more. I don't know, which, that's probably true. But yeah, it was like, it's almost like when you said that, to internalize it, I was like, oh no, I think I get that.
Yeah.
I think that's what I was doing. Yes.
And I think that helps with, so some of the tricky parts of the Psalms are some of the lament Psalms, and even that, like the angry Psalms. So you got the sad Psalms and the angry Psalms.
Oh,
and
right.
Like, what do we do with those? Like, what do we do with these Psalms that are almost like this roller coaster of emotions? And again, if you read them really quickly, it just feels like, what was that? I was here and then I was there and I was up and I was down. I was in the pits and then I'm praising God, and now I'm cursing my enemies, and now I'm back to blessing God. And it all feels a bit confused. But again, that idea of internalizing and sitting in them for long enough to say, where is the invitation to feel this? When I preach on the Psalms, I often say, I think there is an invitation in some of those sad Psalms to be sad, which we don't like that idea. Why would I want to be sad? But if I look at the things of the world that make God sad, or the things in my own life, my own, my sin, that like I want to sit in the sadness of my grief and my loss. I want to sit in the sadness of that so that God can meet me there. And simply the angry Psalms, probably the hardest part of the Psalms, Psalm 137 is the classic people one. Go, what do you do with this? People smashing babies' heads against a rock.
Oh, yes.
Right.
I forgot about that one.
Yeah, I know. But I do think there are things in this world, oppression, injustice, exploitation, that God is angry about, and God is moved by his anger to justice. And there's an invitation there for us to be moved to anger, not a selfish anger, but a righteous anger that seeks justice.
Yes.
So there's this real invitation in the Psalms, but that does require going deep and being willing to go vulnerable, because it's scary to sit in some of those emotions and those imaginations that feel maybe a bit risky or a bit,
Yes, I guess in some ways that the Psalms can be somewhat of a bit of a measuring rod for ourselves to be able to see the level of comfort we have with certain emotions we even have in ourselves, right? Because I think if you're like, I used to be this many years ago, but I've got to come to terms with my own anger. Yeah. But, like I was very uncomfortable with anything that was angry. And to be able to read something like those angry Psalms, I would have been very like, oh, no, this is, no, I can't. Yeah. That doesn't seem right, or,
in the Bible.
Yeah, that doesn't belong. That we're supposed to be gentle, but it, obviously we do all experience anger emotionally.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean we express it in the ways that are often, synonymous with anger. But,
Yeah, well, because that's the beauty of the Psalms, isn't it? Because they're prayer and worship. So they're inviting you to express it in an appropriate way. That's what I would say about the angry Psalms too. The angry Psalms aren't actually going and enacting violence and cursing on their enemies. They're praying it to God.
Yes.
Like, okay, I feel this desire for vengeance and, to see my enemies destroyed. What do I do with that desire? I don't go and take it out on those people that I feel that about. I actually bring it to God in prayer and let him get out. And I think there's a real, there's something amazing in that. And perhaps some people talk about it as a bit cathartic, but also just like spiritually, just something really important about trusting God with the breadth of our human emotions in prayer, that nothing's out of bounds in prayer. You can whatever you're feeling to God in prayer and in worship.
And he knows all of it anyway. Like I sometimes,
right?
Yeah, that's right. I've on the odd occasion, a friend will say to me something like, "Oh, no, I shouldn't say that." Or I'll go, "But you already thought it, so God already knows about it. So maybe you should go talk to him about it, because you're not hiding it from him anyway." So, but yeah, so it is like such an incredible invitation, really, if you put it in that way. Because I suppose, I guess I know that when you are bringing this stuff to God, there's more chance, there's way more potential for healing of those emotions to come as well, because you're in the presence of God himself, and you're not holding anything back.
That's right. Yeah, you're sort of holding those emotions before God and letting him speak into them and sift through them and do what he wants with them. Yeah, and the same, as I said, that we just talked about emotion quite a bit, but same with the embodiment and the imagination of them. Like the idea of using our imaginations in prayer, it's probably not one most people are familiar with, but the Psalms do it all the time. Like this idea of imagining and picturing what could be and bringing that before God and discerning what he's speaking into that is so powerful.
Very true. Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed that, and I hope the listeners also thoroughly enjoy this. Thank you so much for being on the podcast, and bless you.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Pink Elephant. You can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, or you can check out my resources on my website, meljsayward.com.